This ARC research update focuses on the UK government's decision to lock down and to place extra restrictions on people with underlying conditions and older people. Using the LexisNexis database, the preliminary findings of a media analysis of vulnerable groups during the pandemic are presented. Given that so much time and space has been committed to speak about older people during the crisis, this research update gives voice to older people's own views on the pandemic. We have focused on views as they were expressed in letters to major UK national newspapers such as The Guardian, The Telegraph and The Times, as well as tabloids such as Mail Online and The Express, and Sunday papers such as The Sunday Times. Older people wrote to national UK newspapers about the age-based lockdown in some numbers. Most of the letters were about older people's position in families, how necessary they are to the functioning of family and society, and how younger people, particularly parents of young children, are dependent on them for childcare. In an article headlined "I Missed the Hugs," Max 2020 cited a survey of 1,000 members of Gransnet claiming that half provide regular childcare within their families, saving the economy about £22.5 billion per annum. The sentiment expressed in that article is reflected in numerous letters written by grandparents reporting that one of the most meaningful aspects of their lives, their role as a grandparent, had been lost to them. Across the political spectrum, both right and left-leaning publications such as The Telegraph and The Guardian had submissions from older people and their advocates, making strong pleas for liberty. A letter from Hella Pick from London exclaimed, "I live on my own. For me, the imposition of self-isolation for any length of time, in plain words, being caged in, would be a tantamount to a living death." As lockdown continued and the negative association between older age, underlying conditions and COVID-19 became more apparent, there were more calls for a more nuanced, stratified approach to age-based lockdown restrictions. An intervention from the British Medical Association and the Royal College of General Practitioners in the first week of May 2020 was important, as both organisations insisted that a person's age should not determine whether they are at high risk or not. Under current NHS plans, those aged over 70 are deemed as being at high risk of contracting COVID-19. The two groups, however, has stated a blanket ban on any section of the population would be unacceptable. We were surprised that care homes and the vulnerability of older people in care homes to isolation and neglect, as well as COVID-19, were barely present in the results of our search. However, in a letter to The Guardian on 28th of April 2020, Brian Parrott, a retired social worker with responsibility for older people's services, expressed deep regret that, after years of arguing for funding to allow frail older people to be discharged from hospitals, when it finally happened in the midst of the pandemic, the lack of a testing regime meant that both older people and their carers were left to die. Parrott's letter echoes the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee's damning review of successive governments' failure to reform the social care sector. Years of inattention, funding cuts and delayed reforms have been compounded by the government's slow, inconsistent and at times negligent approach to giving the sector the support it needed during the pandemic. The message to protect the NHS simply did not apply to those older people in the hundreds of small residential homes staffed by underpaid workers and run by managers struggling to purchase personal protective equipment. Suspended as they were outside the NHS, they were not protected. In fact, the opposite happened and they were actively exposed to additional vulnerabilities. As a result, many of them died. The emphasis on the over 70s should stay at home worked to the detriment of people living in residential care, who were actually the most clinically vulnerable. People in this group are often too frail or ill to speak for themselves. Arguably, their voices are completely absent from public debate. This relates to a point made by columnist John Harris in The Guardian on the 26th of April. Coronavirus has deepened prejudice against older people is the only substantive article we found which link deaths in care homes to the status of older people in society. Harris connects the deaths in care homes to the sorry state of social care, which exists as a dysfunctional and disparate archipelago of homes and so-called providers. Harris's reference to the convenient blaming of older people for the current plight of younger generations and the dangers of fueling such age-based social division demonstrates a much-needed understanding of the complexity of life course transitions and the role of welfare in smoothing our path from birth to death. As the global pandemic has revealed the harsh implications of inequalities in health, gender, age and ethnicity, it is worth taking the time to think about what the situation of older people in the pandemic can help us to learn about age discrimination and inequality. There are 3 key points we can learn from the pandemic. First, older people are not all the same, and a policy that treats them as such is bound to fail. Second, the pandemic lays bare the absence of older people's voices from emergency situations. There is a need for older people to participate in shaping responses to and recovery from the pandemic in a way that recognises their human rights and dignity. Third, what happens in social care settings has huge implications for other healthcare sectors. Underfunding and ignoring social care has profound implications for the broader health of a nation. We desperately need a new system of social care which is not only properly funded but is acutely focused on those in need and aware of the massive inequalities within older birth cohorts.